I see. Okay. We have everybody on?
We should be, let me just check if Fumi is on and Chidi.
Hello.
Hey, Kole, how are you?
Very well, very well. Sorry, I need to send the link to other people who have been harassing me.
Kole, I have the link now.
Great. Okay, no, there are others. There are who are looking for it as well. Let me see. Mahmoud. Eddie Mahmoud.
So we are almost there, Kole. Huh?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Clearly.
Oh, Odia, you're very clear. With all these, your books, but they look so old, Odia. I don't know what is happening.
But those are my books. You want me to bring the new sets? I will go downstairs. If I go downstairs, I won't hear what you are saying.
Okay, okay. Okay, I think Akwasi wanted the link also. Let me see.
I thought he was on. He's already in the chat room.
Akwasi?
Yes. Akwasi Aidu?
Yeah. No, I don't see him there. Unless there is another chat room. Let me
Good morning, Dr. Kole.
see.
He's here already. Hello, Dr. Kole.
He's there? Okay.
Good morning, sir. He's here, Akwasi Aido.
Yeah. So Akwasi is in?
Yes,
good morning.
as one of the attendees.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay, Fumi is calling. Let me see what is happening to her. Hello. Hi, Fumi. Why is that? Shamsuddin, Fumi is on the line, but we can't see her. Do you know?
Esther is working on it.
Okay, they say Esther is working on it. Sorry about that. Okay, Taba.
Is Coyote on the line? Is the governor on the line?
Well, I can't see, but I don't know whether Shamsuddin sees it or not.
So, yeah, Chidi is on the line.
He's not on the line yet.
Okay.
Horace, my apologies. I sent that message late. Huh?
Too late, and
yes?
you took too long to respond because we missed you. We missed you on the program, but it's okay. We'll have to have a private discussion on this, not in the middle of this.
No problem.
I realized that I was sending to a number you gave me that was South African.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hidayat.
Hidayat is on the line?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Fumi.
How are you this morning? Hidayat, how are you?
Bad. How are you?
Good.
Hidayat, you are muted now. Okay. So Akwasi is also saying he's not muted, but we can't hear him. Esther, do you want to check that one or Shamsuddin?
And then we have
Okay,
to
so
check.
I'm checking him, sir.
Okay.
We need to check if Awino is on.
She is on.
She's on.
She's on.
Lynn gave her apologies. Okay.
And also there's Tone from Women FM. She said that she cannot hear. Esther, maybe you may also check that one.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Hey, free at last. Here you are. Kole, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, bro.
How are you, Kwasi?
Yeah. Hey, I think
Should we thank Corona for letting us see like this?
Exactly. Maybe there is, there is some positive side of this thing.
Hey, Horace, how you doing?
He's keeping faith, he's keeping well, maintain a spirit of positive mentally, especially given where we are at the moment. Mental alertness.
Esther?
Well, I have to tell you, since he was at the University of Dar es Salaam, I don't know how long, 30 years ago, Prof?
40 years ago now.
40 years ago. So your genes, we have to clone you. And so nice to see you, Prof.
Thank God, nice to see you. I hope I'm not the same. I hope I'm a bit wiser.
Oh, your hair alone says you are wiser, you and Odia. Hey, and my sister, how are you?
Very well. I
Esther?
cannot believe it.
Oh.
I can't believe how,
the IGC members are saying that they can't connect, that he said the meeting was scheduled for 29/5/2020.
No, it's for 30th. The invitation that was sent is for 30th.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Today.
Yeah. Let me call Oti because he's the one who is sending the message.
Okay, sir.
Whether he's the one that.
So, colleagues, we will have to start in the next 2 minutes.
Okay.
So that we've got so many hellos. I mean,
Oti, I think is it that when you connect, it says that.
Oh, you're looking great.
And so are you, by the way.
It's great.
You're looking even younger than I remember.
Oh, that I don't know. I'm trying to look at my beard. I'm trying to imitate and Horace.
Even that beard says it all.
Younger than me in a way that embarrasses me.
Comrade Odia, I don't know about that. But I get in the chat room, I get the sense that Babaya is here with us.
Okay.
So it seems we have quite an audience.
Yeah, we have quite an audience. You're right, Hollis.
How many people are on board already?
Yeah, we've got 89 with 90,
Amazing.
about 89, 90. Yeah. So I'm waiting for Coyote.
You heard from him?
Not yet.
No, he said he's connecting now. He said he's connecting now.
Okay.
Okay. I think we should start, isn't it?
He is our first.
No. Is he the first? Okay. Sorry.
If he's connecting, he'll be here in 1 minute.
I think.
Am I looking at that?
I think in the program, I think we have the welcome, and then there's reading from Odia, and then there's a remark by Coyote.
No. Okay. So okay. So I think we can. Should we start?
I think so. Or what do you people think?
If we start at 7:15, which is 1 minute from now, it may not make much of a difference, but at least we may have those who are calling in join us.
Okay. Apologies to all those who are online. To say that we are starting at 6. What now? Sorry, I'm looking at my Chicago time. So it's at 2. Please apologies, but surely we are starting any moment from now.
Starting in 52 seconds.
In 52 seconds. Okay. So you have a second so that we can continue with that one as well. So maybe we have to do some countdown to the seconds.
Well, we've got 3 more people joined. It's now 92.
Okay. Webinar commemoration celebration of our friends, our comrades, Tajuddin Ibrahim, of course, as well as Abubakar Momo. Many of us have known him, and both of them, one of them May 25th, the other one May 29th. I think that the best description of Taju is that he's the only African head of state that we never had, because of his networks, because of his friends, because of the commitment and passion for the people of the continent, and as well as, of course, his Afro optimism. Another of our friend and our colleague, both of them, of course, are founding members of the Center for Democracy and Development, and both of them are Pan-Africanist. I think that Momo really, both from his work, which activities in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of his organizational activities on the continent, he has demonstrated that he has been very much been part of us as well. So it is on those notes that we thought that, okay, why don't we try to come together and have this commemoration? And I'm very excited and very glad that for many years, actually, we have been thinking about having a Pan-African commemoration. Unfortunately, we never had one, but, you know, friends and colleagues, you know, organized something in Nairobi, others in Abuja, or in other parts of the world as well. But this time around, I think that fortunately or unfortunately, because of the virus, I think we have really been able to take advantage of the technology, and thanks to both Chidi and Brian, who felt that, look, maybe we should make it one event and make it possible for us to have it this time around. So thank you both of you for reminding us and for taking advantage of this opportunity that we have. Ordinarily, Hidayat Hassan, who you can see, is supposed to give the welcome address, but because Hidayat claimed that she has sore throat, but I confirmed that she doesn't have COVID-19, so she asked me to give the welcome on behalf of the Center for Democracy and Development and to appreciate all of you who have really asked everyone to come. And the last minute, I think that all of you have responded to that. And many of you are actually regulars in so many ways. Whenever we ask you to come to this event, I think that you have really shown your face and to be able to confirm. I'm just giving the welcome address on behalf of Hidayat, who delegated her boss to give the welcome address.
Untouchable, on a beach holidaying from the dirty oil of gladiators and marketers. In the innocence of weak sand, you emerged free and full of spirit, in spite of vultures, in the midst of hyenas. You remained a virgin unfazed by sandstorms, firebrand in hand, yielding acid veracity for the day of evil to die. You learned from braving Harmattan fires to cherish hidden reserves of sinews, your right fist always up to redeem. You reinvented a continent resistant to trickster gods, grandstanding across seas of sand and lakes and rivers from Cairo to the Cape. You sought always to move, bold tracery of zeal, to take the songs of the decade away from them who agonize. On the rostrum, on Africa's day, you stood erect, clenched fist upraised in your crumpled kente of many demos. A virgin unfazed by sandstorms, a bird in full sprout, a flower untouchable, yielding acid veracity. You took away songs of the decade from them who agonize to lift those who organize, that the day of evil may die. When from the dungeon under the sea rose the impossible monster to the assizes of the sun, and from the ballads of the gated sky, you heard the wild beasts calling each to each in wide accents to vote, full of guile at the wrenching heartiness, too full and aglow with sass at the festive massacre of innocence. You dare to find safety in jeopardy on the backs of hippopotami and crocodiles. You crossed the lake of intrigue, your heart in your mouth. You moved to the other side to be circumcised by hard experience unrepeatable. You knew then what we know now, that in the belly of the whale is neither sentence nor reprieve, only fate abiding in asphyxia of gumption, in the safety always to be found in jeopardy. We are worshippers of your undying favor, riding the mare of memory down the savannah plains your candor watered. We come to the dreams we loved together, staring back at death's ambush, seeking to carry the world up rock hills that rolled at your exit on that sad Nairobi night. We heave the dreams up to a toast to your green acres, plots of mind that you altered, ogling wonderlands, defying borderlands, halting the cunning of Harmattan wings, with undying craving for communion. You stood for the defeat of fear. To thwart the unknown was your ken, with memories of the future down the savannah plains that your candor watered. Yes, we come to your patch to valorize green acres. How well you temper sandstorms that ripped baobabs, smothering shrubs to which you wished always to take a sea of fresh water. How irrigate the desert to unhinge hungers that smote the sun and humiliated nations. how forget that hosted to seas of sand, you refilled every cup with blazing hope, drunken to the dregs. Because I don't think I have time, there is a poem I always promised I will read here for Taju's daughter. Before I read it, this is for the children. This was written for the day when he was buried. The children came to the arrival of your not arriving, wearing your larger eyes, pinpoint ready to get home to the promise you incarnated. The children kept coming to where you stood at your post, once upon a promise to lift up the drooping flower heads, pregnable moon faces by the roadside. The children came expectant of sun and light, malls beaten by action tenses. Still they came to place beds on platforms, molehills and housetops, nothing hidden, nothing bad, from eyes that you gave them to see with. They wish to replace wild elephant grass with luxuriant plots of millet, sorghum, and maize. Resurgent hope, bouncing against fear, they had your want to cure the dark moles of widow and almajiri. But who would teach them now to outclass the higher geographies at street level, on horseback, sowing maps that disarm the anger of generations overcome by hunger? This one is a personal poem called Aisha's Choice. And those who know the story, we follow where it's coming from. I think she was 7 or 8 when this incident occurred. After her mommy said the Almighty was responsible for the silky thresh of blonde hair spotted by her classmate, she asked, is God a hairdresser? She had to know why. Her matted crown was different, all kinky roughage that won't stretch without cajolery of hot iron. How so unfair, she could add. Subtract and multiply, speak Queen's English better than anyone else in class, but God made her no frilly hair. As mommy would say, she had to ask daddy, who answers even the unanswerable with a cackle, a grunt. Daddy pulled his pipe from between his lips. He could wake whole neighborhoods with his heavy ball of laughter. Who could answer questions better? Is God really a hairdresser? She asked, as mommy would say. Shaking the shine of his balding, daddy threw her a yes, a wonderful hairdresser. And your style is a custom made, and your style is custom made for you, my daughter. To plait, weave, or mop a rasta bean to wow all the world when you grow up. Since this is the season when almajiris are on the streets and on the move, and we are yet to design a system capable of housing up to 15 million out-of-school children, let me read these almajiri poems, which is a response to one of Tajuddin's columns. It's called Almajiri Boko. It is one of 5 poems. It was when the land was as fertile as the mind of the folk, and granite pyramids mimicking the ziggurat of Babel climbed into the sky and Hamatan haze from as far as the eye could see. As postcards would advertise it, beyond the bounty of those years when salvation shook hands with salvation, and we knew it. In those days, we were home to ample leftovers for all comers from the demanding streets, for whom the pious of heart had handfuls ready to spare at every given dinner. Here on earth and on the road to heaven, we drew away from the unclean in bulbous rags, favored by the Almighty, who set our right to be fed as heirs, fitted into dry, cleaned uniforms, and uphill to green, white, green abodes of knowledge and so much light. Too self-satisfied to be on the lookout, we who did not have to try in order to own, we saw not the coming of the rain of oil, arrival of bounty that held a famished road, so much warning from the creeks in its entries. After the sandstorm and anthill swoop of termites had harried the savannah as curse and blessing, it was a time out of division of the siblings, between medicants on holy mission and the scholars in hopeless job hunts. Jauntily getting used to a world in regress, we banded with talakawas of our allies. In mud world, mud-roofed coulées, bowels of loot, we entered the age of duplicity and handouts. Easy back off from starch shares to rags, from requited sweat to sheer distancing. At the behest of loot sharers drawing lines between the deserving, freed from labor, and the drones of the unslippered work, the unaccounted folk of our brave allies. They, without art by which to know for whom the earth glitters, dreamt of heaven in the famine of impunity and license, in our age of dust that was always there, now as prophecy, fulfilled in unity of opposites, we parley in our allies, Almajirai and Boko, a camaraderie of the jobless at the Suya corner, all consumed by the same spirit of want, equalized by poverty of spirit, death of answers, for the land still fertile. But who cares? I don't know how many minutes I have.
I think we don't have many minutes now, but
okay,
we can give you 2 minutes.
Thanks, Amy. Now all frailties convoked, groundings revoked. I forgive the happenstance of salt, a trickle for you who was a taste of salt in every gathering. I glare at the sky and watch the sky go back, the same as when the world began. Your humanity's gossip, toasting the land where you never said no to mortality and transience of the flesh. Every vein you held out was a dream of borderless geographies, always affirming the continent, root and grain. Taju, you could not say no to mortality's transient flesh, but your yes to life was everywhere.
Good. So I think Brian will take over after Kayode's welcome remarks, but let me just say that children, but I think both of Taju and Momo, but I think that thinking about it again, I think they are still really, after all these years, they are still in a very difficult situation to talk about their dads. So we thought that probably it's not a good idea to bring them on. So that is why we have not get them here. So that is the reason why you may not be able to see them. But I'm happy that Tawa has joined us, and I think that they will try to project her, include her at some point as well. So on this note, may I now call on Kayode, who, as you know, have been associated with all these much more longer history of all the activities that have been happening with them. Of course, certainly the headline of the cable when Momo died, I think the headline was Momo who survived the brutality in Ekiti. So I thought that really strengthened that shows the relationship between Abu and Kayode as well. So Kayode is next, your turn.
Thank you, Colin. Let me thank all our comrades and friends for joining us in this memorial event. I see many familiar faces. Brother Horace all the way from Syracuse, Brian, Fumi, of course, restless 70-year-old Odia, and several of our friends who are here. Well, for me, this is a moment of reflection, but it's also a celebration for our two comrades, Taju and Momo. The position is consistent. Africa is not one country, but to them, Africa is indeed a country, because Africa, to both of them, is more than a geographic space. Africa is an idea, and Pan-Africanism is the vehicle for promoting that idea and ideal. And in everything that they did, they always projected possibilities rather than challenges, opportunities rather than difficulties. And they were inveterate optimists at all times. In spite of the difficulties, the struggles, I can almost imagine Taju being here in the midst of COVID-19, and as we watch our television across cities in the United States full of protest over Floyd George's brutal killings, Taju would have done a postcard this week connecting the dots, connecting the threads. Momo would have gone ahead to organize a seminar on why the more things change, the more they remain the same in our unequal world. And that for me is why, as much as we continue to mourn the losses of our two comrades, the work that they did in the short period that they were with us is something that we continue to refer to as departure point for the transformation and the liberation of our people in various ways. And that is why reflecting on COVID-19 on the one hand, and on the challenges of political economy, of an unequal world on the other, is a statement rather than agonize about these difficult world that we live in our various ways. That's what we've been doing. I've just seen Brother Kwasi also on the screen now. And all of us have been connected by this singular thread of making a difference in our various communities and constituencies. These were the things that Taju and Abaka Momo stood for. These were the things that we all worked together on. And for sure, the world has not become that changed setting that we all have been struggling. At the same time, it does not call for pessimism on our side. It calls for a better, a more consistent, a more organized resistance to oppression. And as I welcome all of us to this memorial reflection, I also would like, on behalf of the Center for Democracy and Development, of which Taju was the pioneer founder alongside myself and many of us in this audience, thank you for remembering not to forget, because it's always in the midst of all our issues. It's easy not to remember where we have come from and how far we have come in this struggle. But as Taju would always say, we must remember it is a journey. It is not a destination, and the struggle must continue. I welcome all our friends. Thank you.
Actually.
Brian from Kaduna State, can you take on, please?
Yeah, thank you. You know, we're going to be serious in talking about Tajuddin's political thought. But I would say to the speakers that it's also useful, as Kayode will tell you, to remember the Tajuddin anecdotes. It might help people know that Tajuddin was an all-weather, all-seasons. But let me, before I introduce Horace, just give you two quotes from Taju and one from Momo. My last meeting with Momo was in Dakar, and Momo was worried about what we should do to ensure that we immortalize what Taju stood for within the Pan-African space. And when I heard of Momo's passing, I was so upset, because since then, Africa has lost many iconic figures. From those in the arts sector, Miriam Makeba, Winnie Mandela. It has lost many professors, Thandika Mkandawire, and many others that I think that we're all going to reference. And the agreement with Momo then was, let the Tajuddin Memorial Lecture, and we've had some in Nairobi, some in Harare, always, and in London, be a reflection not of Tajuddin, the individual, but of the spirit of activism. So that today we call it a Tajuddin Memorial Lecture, but we are celebrating the spirit of Pan-Africanism. We're celebrating many other activists that we have lost. Tajuddin says, it is a testimony to Nkrumah's success that 40 years after he was overthrown, Ghanaian governments and leaders will still be judged, and judged poorly against him. Even his enemies are forced to acknowledge only committed to the welfare of the people of Ghana and Africa. Time, they say, is a final arbiter. The ideas that Nkrumah lived and died for continue to reverberate across the continent. And then Tajuddin visited India. And this is one of the interviews done by an Indian newspaper. It's to show you how global Taju was and the issues he commented on. He says, I just visited a village just 15 kilometers from Delhi, which still had around 400 kids who did not go to school. There is no school, no sanitation, and no hospital. So I'm not surprised if you have sections of India where poverty is worse, because ultimately it is about power, how those in power relate with those voting for them. I asked these people, don't you vote? They said, yes, we do, but we are only 700, and therefore we are not significant. So even democracy is not a protection for a marginalized group. It is a paradox in India. How can India go to space without all Indians going to school? So it is about how the people in power prioritize. And then Momo writing, addressing, you will remember, let's problematize the problematic. You remember that famous Momo saying, which means that we need to look at more than one angle. So Momo says social status, hierarchy, and class have all come to place in having economic and political access. The spirit of potentials of our youth are being killed. Their confidence in the system is fast eroding. They are desolate, agitated, and angry. Some of them have become economic migrants. Others have sought refugee status in Europe and North America. Yet others have constituted a social menace by their criminal behavior that has undermined the image of the country abroad, he said. They can no longer find exemplars, the kind of selfless and patriotic citizens who led us in the past. Everybody wants to condemn the other person, but very few people want to be upright and behave appropriately. This is because greed, materialism, and insatiable quest for ill-gotten wealth, and the get-rich-quick syndrome have ravaged our public political correctness. There is no. This was in Abuja in 2016. The title of the meeting that Momo was addressing was Towards Creative Leadership. As a battle-hardened fighter, like Taju, an irreverent person, Malcolm X, describing the March on Washington, said that the invitation had not been sent to those Negroes who are liable to say anything. I often say to Taju that this described him, because we would agree when going to heads of state meetings what the script was. And you can rest assured, as you will hear today, that Taju was liable to say anything. His conscience was his God. So Professor Horace Campbell, who not only worked with Taju, but who has been with the global Pan-African movement and is on the Pan-African Congress, the North American Congress, and knows both sides of the global Pan-African movement, the continental one and the North American and the European and the Latin American ones, will speak to us for about, Horace, is 7 to 8 minutes okay for you, or 10?
Oh, that's fine. I am fine. I'm here to participate in the spirit of what's going on. 5 is good enough.
So over to you, Horace. Huh?
Yes. Well, first, I want to send greetings and salutations to all those who are participating in this celebration. I see the names of so many comrades who we have not seen for a long time. We have not seen you in the flesh, but we know what you're doing, and we want to send greetings. We also want to send greetings to all of the families of Taju and Momo, and we want to assure you that we are still with you as you continue this journey. As was rightly pointed out, this is not a sprint, it's a journey. And your lives were touched by Taju and Momo. I also want to send greetings to those who are not in Puntua, in the school that was established in Puntua in the past 12 years, from those who continue to communicate, show that the foresight that Tajuddin had about the importance of the youth and their education should never be forgotten. And it's not surprising that when he went to India, he went to see what the conditions were in the village. It is most pressing that we reflect on what Tajuddin and Momo would consider in this moment. And the title of this memorial is not only to celebrate them as individuals, but also to be able for us to understand this moment. How do we make sense of the fact that or 1.5 million persons have died in 6 weeks of a virus that appears out of nowhere. How is it that we can make sense of the fact that in the past 3 months, we have had an economic crisis that is now considered worse than the economic depression of 1929? And if we listen to the writings of economists, whether the economists from the IMF itself or Nouriel Roubini, who has written about this depression as being a 10-year depression, or Indian economist Jayata Ghosh, who said that this is unprecedented. And if we go from the economists to the real live conditions of people who have succumbed to this pandemic, one of the tasks Taju and Momo assigned to themselves is to be that they lived in. If you lived and worked with Tajuddin, you will remember that wherever he was, he would set aside a moment, and on Tuesday night, he probably would not sleep. He'd be writing a postcard to try to bring people up to date about what's going on. So how do we communicate to global Africa and to the world in general about this, what is called a financial crisis? Is it a financial crisis? And if we accept what Nouriel Roubini said, that this crisis will be a depression of more than 10 years, what are the implications for the African peoples? Well, one thing we do know about the last depression in 1929, we do know that in the case of Europe, especially Britain, France, and Belgium, the costs of the depression were transferred onto the backs and shoulders of African people, people in Indonesia, people in India, people who were colonized. The difference is, in this moment, most, if not 98% of those societies have formal independence. But even with formal independence, after 1945, the international financial system that was established was to establish institutions to be able to manage the economies of the countries that were formerly colonial. So when we talk about a financial crisis today, how is it possible for the United States government to be able to provide a surplus of $6 trillion in the last 2 months to be able to bail out the banks? And we should ask ourselves, even if it is $100 trillion, can the banks be bailed out? Is the working of the international financial system that is built on the US dollar capable of surviving this crisis? I think what we are now understanding is the clear limit of the military management of the international system, that the US dollar is be able to continue as the currency of world and international trade based on the military management of the system. And so in the last depression, we know that the depression was resolved by war. And just as in 1935, the Italians invaded Abyssinia, and that spurred greater activity on the Pan-Africanist movement, so the intervention by NATO in Libya has spurred a greater understanding of how the capitalist crisis is leading to war. But in the midst of this capitalist crisis leading to war, the contradictions among the Europeans have multiplied to the point that France has been diminished and the Germans have moved in to give greater political leadership within the European Union and had the gall to call what they call a Berlin Conference in January of this year. We know what the Berlin Conference of 1885 wrought. The Pan-African movement in 1900 was called in response to the Berlin Conference of 1885. Today, the independence of Africa and the organization and ensure that the Pan-African movement is a movement, as Tajuddin says, a movement that has moved out of the governmental corridors to the streets in the marketplace among the ordinary people. And so we see that even the day that is called African Liberation Day has been turned by these governments into something that is called Africa Day, devoid of any of the understanding of the struggles and sacrifices that Africans have fought for over the past 150 years. And in the streets of Minneapolis, as we speak, young people who were from the Sudan, young African Americans, young white workers, young workers of color are in the streets of Minneapolis showing practically what Pan-Africanism means. And Tajuddin's words are echoing in the minds of these youth that we should not despair, we should not mourn, we should organize. And as we organize, the question that has been raised is, how do we ensure that in this moment, at the 11 years after Taju, 4 years after Momo, we do not despair and we have the clarity to understand how to go forward. When we are talking about peace and silencing guns, what would that mean in Nigeria, in Funtua, in Borno State, in the Lake Chad region? What is meant by the total unification of Africa? How can we advance the work that was done in 2007 at the AU meeting in Accra, when the push was for a common currency? One of the clear outcomes of this financial crisis is the breakup of the dollar as a currency of world trade. And it is very clear now that we are moving towards a multipolar currency world, with the euro seeking to entrench itself in the dollar, against the dollar. It is for that reason why the Germans moved the French to break from the CFA so the euro can have better control over African resources. Will African intellectuals and workers respond to this by working harder to push for the coming together of the African currency? These questions abound at this present moment when we respond to the coronavirus. So the coronavirus has sharpened the question of social justice. The coronavirus has sharpened the question of peace, and the coronavirus has sharpened the question of why we need organization among the people, especially among the youth, to say that this is the moment to seize the African future.
For that, Horace, and Horace has actually helped to place us into thinking about the bigger pictures. Fumi, and Taju would have said really Fumi, you know. And I don't know why he always repeated really 3 times, but Fumi, over to you. I mean, for colleagues who've just joined us, we're using our reference Abubakar Momo and Tajuddin Abdul Rahim to engage with the question from global financial crisis to global coronavirus. Fumi, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I think those of us who know what Tajuddin and Abu represented in our lives, personally, professionally, and in the global discourse around Pan-Africanism, around particular modes and forms of leadership, around the next generation in particular, when one thinks about the work of Abu, we will know that they will have so much to say at this particular point in time. And I want to reflect on this topic from two points of view. One is the continental Pan-African view of the world. I think they would have had much to say. I think it was Kayode who said what they might be doing now that, and I do agree. These last few Thursdays, Tajuddin would have posted a few postcards and they would have been around some fundamental issues. It's true, Minnesota would have been one of them without doubt. But I think that Tajuddin would have reflected on the Pan-African agenda and the silence of the African Union at this moment, at this COVID-19 moment. That silence has been deafening, that as the world has retreated into the, all the nations of the world have retreated into their own borders and dealt with their own challenges. And I dare say even in Nigeria, there has been no other option but for state governments to, deal directly with their situations and their citizens. For Pan-Africanism, the very concept, the very idea of it, which individuals across borders, across countries of the world, wherever they are, with the African idea, has at its core the idea that we mobilize together for the transformation of Africans, wherever they might be, of the African condition. And I think when you go back, say to 2002, that period when we talked about NEPAD and the vision of a new Africa, we thought that today we'll be at a place where the collectivity of African states will be responding to African peoples in particular ways. And the silence of the African Union at this moment in time says something about how we should be thinking about leadership of the future. And I don't want to pronounce myself about what specifically Taju would have said, but I want to suggest that he probably would have picked up the phone, spoken to Kagame a little bit, spoken to President Kagame, would have spoken to President Museveni, and had something to say about how they might be leading the pack or not leading the pack. We know that from our own recollections of Taju's work. And I think Abu Bakar Momo would have taken his own scholarship to the cross-section of individuals that care to understand how African solidarity should work at the individual level at this point in time. I can think of the work he'll be doing with young people. And I think there's a lot to be done. And there's a lot that their work tells us about the future of the continent that we all pursued together. But I want to go to my next set of points, and that will be my last set of points as well, in order to keep this within time, to points of personal reflections about these individuals. How has their work continued from my own vantage point of the African Leadership Center across the board? Every year, and there are two things I notice. Every year, when we have what we call the simulation seminars, I've noticed that in the past 10 years, every other year, students simulate Tajuddin's work. They simulate his voice. They talk about, when they're talking about either the failings or successes, limited successes of the African Union around particular peace and security issues, you suddenly see them taking on the persona of Tajuddin Abdurrahim. They have not seen, they never met him, many of them. They have seen his videos, they have read his work, and they understand what he stands for. I think that kind of legacy is one that we have to take solace in at this point in time. With Abubakar Momo, who was a mentor directly. I have to say that some of our fellows at the launch of the African Leadership Center in Nairobi met Taju on the margins of it, but they, at the time, they did not even know the quality of who they were meeting until they heard him a couple of times. The new generation never met him. But Abubakar Momo was a mentor at the African Leadership Center. He spoke to those students directly. What their recollection of Abu is as clear today as at any other time. The work that he has done about this next generation also continues to be something that in the literature is regarded very highly. But my last point is actually about Abu and what struck me. That was 3 years ago at the African Leadership Center. Normally this June, we would all be in Nairobi interviewing our students, the next crop of ALC students. Of course, my current role at King's means I can't always sit there, but 3 years ago, I think I made it into that interview. One student from my state, from Ekiti State, who was extremely passionate, who we asked about his own sense of, what was his mission? What change did he want to make by coming to the African Leadership Center? And then you'll ask them about the role model. He was very passionate about change, about Nigeria, about the things he would do once he got this fellowship. Then he was asked who his role model was. The guy says, he's now late. This professor, I met him somewhere, and he mentioned what conference he met him. And he said, after that, he will call me every so often to encourage me. He will ask me how I'm getting on. And then sometimes he will send me money because this guy was really struggling just to try to get to the next stage of his career. And he says, I didn't know him before. And of course, you all know Abu was not from Ekiti State, but he had friends there. It didn't matter where the young person was. And the same applied to Taju. He would tell me, just keep trying. He would send me money if I needed it. And he mentioned how much Abu has sent to him. And he says, this man meant so much in my life. He's now late. His name is Abubakar Momo. I have to say that tears were just rolling down my eyes. And they were tears of joy in many ways because his legacy was clear. And actually, somebody who I never met who was in an interview was saying this about Abubakar Momo. But the same is also true for the young people that he mentored at the African Leadership Center. Penda Diallo, Nyanka, all the young people that he would talk to, Eka, who is now a senior lecturer in her own right. So their legacies are rich. Is the point under. Their legacies can be really tapped at the personal level, at the intellectual level and professional level, and there's so much work to be done. And I think it's a real privilege to be able to commemorate these two friends, brothers, colleagues, global citizens in this way. Thank you so much.
Fumi, I want to link Fumi, Tajuddin, and Awino, and Dismas. So Awino had a meeting in, was it in Kampala or in Nairobi, on sexual and gender-based violence. It was my first encounter with Awino, and I was late for our meeting. It was raining. She phoned me. I think I was 4 hours late. But the venue of the meeting and where I was less than actually 500 meters. And part of the reason why I was delayed was because of Tajuddin. He says, no, when you are preparing for anything important, everything had Sylvia, who's on the call, who worked with Taju in the office, we will ask her at some stage to reflect. But I told Awino I got spooked when I saw the poster with all the names, because Awino, Lino Some, myself, and a few others were with Taju the night before he died. That week, there were two parties back to back in Nairobi, and Taju and I spent a lot of time together, but Taju liked to host. And Awino was one of the people that, the comrades that Taju always would have over, and they liked to have a good argument and a good laugh. But Dismas and I met. I did not know that Taju would pass on that night. When we met in Midrand, we met in South Africa, because actually Taju had asked me to go and represent him at the Pan-African Parliament, and he was going to Rwanda. We were with Bibian Mbaye, and we spent a whole lot of time talking about Taju, only to discover a few hours later that he had been murdered. He had been killed. And I still use that term, and I will explain later. So Dismas, I would like to have your reflections. Dismas, as you know, was, I think, one of the first African journalists in Rwanda who went into Rwanda during the genocide. And so it would be useful to hear Dismas, who's an old colleague and comrade of Tajuddin's. Dismas. And I'm not sure why Dismas disappeared. He was here all along.
Okay. Dismas is reporting problems, challenges with audio.
Okay, so let's move on to Awino. Awino, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Brian. And let me also extend my thanks to CDD West Africa for convening this event. You're quite right that I met Taju at the same time that I met you, and I met the late Thomas Deve, amongst many other great Pan-Africanists who were working in Nairobi at the time. I was much younger than I am at the moment, and I cherish a lot of those memories. And I think one brief anecdote that I want to make before I move on to make my comments is that Tajuddin was a great connector. And I think he belongs to that generation that I want to argue the Fumis, yourself, people like good old Professor Hatchful belong to, which is the generation of Africans who knew that their role was to open doors for younger people. Their role was not to occupy space and limit the opportunities for those younger than them who had bright ideas, who could enter the space as well, and engage robustly with ongoing debates. And so that is something that I think a lot of us who are now potentially occupying positions that may be considered positions of power or positions of leadership should really reflect on. What is our role in opening doors? What is our role in connecting and creating spaces for those who are younger than us to also have an opportunity to expand their ideas, expand their horizons? One cannot be the only great chief in town. We need to be able to create multiple chiefs and multiple leaders to expand our analysis and benefit the continent. I want to draw on an article that Taju wrote as one of his postcards as an entry point into my remarks. And this article was called Mbeki, One Man, No Matter How Bright, Does Not a Forest Make. And the statement that I want to reflect on, which he ends the article with, is this one. He says, the humbling of Thabo is a welcome metaphor for the kind of new leadership that Africa desperately needs, serving at the pleasure of the masses who can dispense with your service as and when they democratically deem fit. I think one of the things that we have seen, and there's been a running thread around the conversation of youthhood from the previous speakers on this panel, is that one of the things that we have greatly witnessed across the African continent in the last 10 years or so is the recognition that, this dud that we have been sold around regular elections and particular performances of the social contract are no longer working for the vast majority of our citizens. And the young people have demonstrated that they will rewrite the social contract because the choice of leaders is not occurring through the ballot box. It's not occurring through the technological fixes that are being sold to us as the way in which to resolve, sort of our ability to hold free and fair elections. So from Egypt, Tunisia, Burkina Faso, we can name all of these examples and Zimbabwe, we can name all these examples where young people have mobilized over time. And this is consistent movement building work that has illustrated the power of the people to actually transform the ways in which our continent is being run. I think one of the central things that is emerging for us at this COVID-19 moment, and Fumi is a leadership scholar, so this is something that she can comment on much more robustly than I can, is the question of leadership, the question of the kind of leadership that the African continent writ large deserves, and how it is as people who are in charge of putting people into office can ensure that we get the kind of leadership that we require. The sort of cocktail of measures and responses that many African countries have had to adopt because of the nature of COVID-19 have illustrated or have sort of excavated in very, very stark terms the very deep structural inequalities that exist across our continent. These structural inequalities, as we have always known, are mapped alongside questions of generation, so youthhood, questions of gender, and obviously questions of class. So for instance, some very quick statistics that we can throw out here is that we have about 16 million young Africans, and those constitute 13.4% of Africa's labor force. 95% of our young people are in the informal sector. 79% of our women work in the informal sector. So when we argue that the measures that we're taking around social distancing, urging people to work home, many of us here can sit behind our computers, get some proper Wi-Fi and do our work remotely, we are dealing with a continent where the vast majority have to eke out a living outside of the home in often very precarious conditions with jobs that have very limited social protection measures and labor conditions that are wanting. For women in particular, we are looking at situations where in markets, and organizations like ActionAid have done some very good work and analysis around this. So if you're talking about market women, the people who feed us, where you go and buy your tomatoes on the side of the road, the onions, these people are working in very precarious conditions. We're not only just talking about transport facilities, we are talking about proper lighting, proper security, and it is these sets of dynamics that increase the kinds of insecurities and precarity that is facing our labor force that exists predominantly within the informal sector. Now, COVID-19 is not the incident that is making us aware of this. It is just exposing it in very stark ways because we are now forced into a situation where our economies have to function in a very limited way. We can no longer sort of hide the reality of how our economies are structured and function. So the big question that I think all of us are asking is that what opportunity does this COVID-19 crisis offer us as a continent? Many of us argued that when Trump was elected into government in the US, that was really the opportunity for us to demystify this idea that democracy or lack of democratic leaders and poor leadership, if you will, is something that is only unique to certain sections of the world, particularly those in the global south. And that moment was also a great opportunity for Africa to set its own agenda. Fumi was talking about the role of the African Union and the role of other regional institutions in actually shifting focus away from larger multilateral institutions such as the United Nations and international governments, bilateral and other governments in shaping our agenda on the African continent. Unfortunately, I don't think we have seized that, we did not seize that moment as well as some of us would have liked to see it done, right? So for my own country, for instance, Kenya, what we ended up was a situation where we said, okay, now we are looking east, and we have therefore mortgaged our entire country, to the Chinese government through a range of loans that those of us who might not even have children, our relatives will continue to pay for a very long time. So this mortgaging of our countries under the guise of saying we are claiming power by looking east has not necessarily resolved our problem. So the charge, perhaps the big task that I'm putting for all of us, including those of us who are sitting in the diaspora, is how then do we grasp this COVID-19 moment as the citizens of Africa? What kinds of conversations do we need to be having about leadership in our countries? What kinds of bubblings of leadership do we need to see emerging from the ground, from the people, to actually shift the ways in which our governments are taking advantage of us on the one hand, but also to shift the structural dynamics that create the vast inequalities that we are the ones who end up feeling in the long run. As I argued in another webinar this week, because all of us are now going to die by webinars, is that we all know that we are not in this together, right? We are feeling the pinch of COVID-19 in vastly different ways. And so how do we use the fact that the vast majority of us do not have the same sets of experiences that our political elite are having, that the global capital that is being mobilized to sort of secure small businesses and big businesses and corporations, and not secure our higher education institutions, not secure our small to medium enterprises. So we know we are not in this together. So if that is the singular thing that brings us together, that we are not in this together, how do we turn that into a massive opportunity? And by no means am I talking about the NGOization of movement building. I'm not saying that NGOs should now take the place of what governments are not doing. We have been very good at that, living despite the government. But how do we up the ante on this conversation on leadership, governance, and the resolution of our structural inequalities? Thanks again.
Wow, I think those are fundamental questions. I'm trying to bring together what you, Fumi, and Horace have already placed on the table as large issues. But before I get to that, let me ask Dismas, if he's still online, to give his remarks. Chidi, you had said he was experiencing problems. Have those problems been resolved? Kampala has a huge problem right now with both electricity and the internet. So if Dismas is not online, I'll open up for some inputs from colleagues on the chat, so that it's not a unidirectional conversation. Dismas, are you on?
He says he hears, but can't be heard.
Okay, so what we will do is we will, I know there are colleagues who are burning to make their input, give their reflections. Remember the topic from global financial crisis to global coronavirus. We're focusing on what should be done and reflecting on the iconic ideas and activism of Tajuddin Abdul Rahim and Abubakar Momo, Abu and Taju. So I'm going to ask colleagues, please raise your hand if you wish to speak, but as I await input, there is a colleague who, so there were four people in Taju's little office in Nairobi. There was Linda, there was Mwaura, and there was Sylvia. I saw Sylvia making comments. Sylvia, I'll give you less than a minute to share your reflections on the topic and the Taju anecdote. Is that okay, Sylvia? Mutually? If Sylvia is not there, I'll ask Otibe Buzo and then Akwasi Aidu to chime in. Just colleagues, keep it short. Comrade Otibe.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much. Continued with this. Yeah, can you hear me? Thank everyone to follow this tradition. And I think something joins both Taju and Abubakar Momo, and that is left ideology. Left ideology. And if you look at the economic crisis to the corona crisis, you see issues about ideology. The economic crisis and the response of the big capitalist countries defied or, eroded all the things they have argued before that time. Before that time, they've argued against governments getting involved in big businesses. You will not have thought that those Western capitalist countries will bail out private companies with such big amounts of money. So all their argument of non-intervention of the state in the economy came crashing like a pack of cards. And my worry is that even if you see people, I'm happy that there are some young people that see these people as, mentors. But my worry is that they see these people, many of the younger generation, as good people. As people because they send money, people because they care for them, people before. But how are we replicating these people? Because what makes them stand out is their left ideology. And many of us who share those kind of ideologies are getting old, are getting to retirement. What legacy are we leaving behind? How do we continue that legacy? I was happy when yesterday Donald Trump said he will send soldiers to Minneapolis because that left governor was not responding properly. At least he identified the governor with an ideology. How do we continue to build a successor generator that will continue this ideology that we believe very strongly? For me, that is a great challenge that all of us need to rise up to.
Thanks, Otive. Akwasi. Akwasi, are you still online?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Hello?
We can hear you, although we can't see your young face, Akwasi.
I know, I'm trying to get my video on, but it's not. So let me, since we don't have much time, I have 3 very short points to make. The first is really to thank Odia, Horace, Kole, all of you, Funmi, for really the wonderful, for the wonderful remarks you've made. Really almost brought tears of appreciation, gratitude to my face. The second point I want to make is that it's an anecdote. This was about 2 months before Taju passed away. He and I were on the phone. We spoke for almost 3 hours, the longest I've stayed on the phone with anybody. And Taju, of course, kept laughing. It got to a point we were talking about Achi Mafeje, who had passed away about 2 years before, in 2007. And I was telling Taju, and Taju was really upset about Achi Mafeje's passing away. So I was telling him, I said, Taju, among the Akan groups in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the belief is that we humans have 3 parts. The first part is our body, which we call the Honam. The body is really what dies and gets buried and decays and so on. The second part is what is called Sum Sum. And Sum Sum is the spirit of the person. And the spirit of the person never dies. And if it's a good spirit that leaves a wonderful legacy and so on, ultimately that's what the Akans celebrate when the person passes away. And the third part was called Nkrabia. And Nkrabia is your purpose on earth. And it's kind of a negotiated, the belief is that it's negotiated, it's a deal negotiated with the divine being, and it's about what you do on earth. And again, if you're on Nkrabia, your purpose of your life combined with your spirit were outstanding, then really that's what counts, not so much the body. I would end my comments with a very short poem I wrote for Taju when he died. Here is to Africa Day. Some say African Unity Day. Some say just Africa Day. Whatever your choice, here is to a freer, safer, united Africa of our dreams. And let's remember our dear Taju, the brother who chose this day. He spoke words with spirits that grew and stayed longer than the baobab, inflamed our passion for this land, spoke truth to power, unveiled leaders who are dealers in dream sale, made history. The brother who ceaselessly said never when a fake yes was a sure path to our woes, wane and wail. Here is another to Taju. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akwasi. Sylvia says the audio is not working properly, but she says she wishes to place on the table as we dialogue, let's remember the question of the African debt, and let's also debt related to how we're using, I suppose, short-term borrowing instruments for long-term borrowing, the infrastructure projects that have a low return. Colleagues, I'm looking for hands.
Mine are.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to apologize for signing on late. I've tried to type a message to reflect that apology. And I know we are pressed for time, so I'll be very quick. I want to take off from where Otive ended. This is because I knew Abubakar Momo more than I knew Taju, even though I also knew Taju quite well. Momo and I belong to the Socialist Congress of Nigeria, which is called SC. So my question is where we of the left are taking the discussion of socialism. I'm saying this because we are all aware of the effort that was made by Bernie Sanders in the US to make that, to return American politics to an ideology that will cater to the people rather than to corporations. Of course, we have a brigand, shall I say, the poster child of vulture capitalism, currently running rumshelled over the whole of America and unashamedly, carrying on. In the light of that, Bernie Sanders tried to make it an issue. And I think to a certain extent to Elizabeth Warren, tried to do it with a little bit of careful balancing. But I think essentially the issue that Otive raised borders on what exactly the left wishes to make the, how shall I put it, the principle of socialism in our world today. I think until we can find a way of comfortably and confidently talking about socialism, unless of course there are ideas about any post-socialism or other than socialism model of governance in our world today that can still achieve the same end. But the bottom line is that we have to have that discussion on, because there's too much misinformation about what socialism is, about what a true government or the people, by the people and for the people is, because it's seen only now as, well, West liberal democracy, which is neoliberalism as we know it, which is vulture capitalism as we know it. monopoly capitalism as we know it. So where do we want to take that discussion and how can we do it? That is what I thought I should bring as a contribution to this conversation, so that whether it is COVID-19 or any other calamity that exposes, the problems of torturing capitalism, we will be able to speak more confidently about that. Thank you.
So, Landry, you are next. Landry. Landry had his hand up.
Yes, okay, yeah. Can you hear me now? Thank you very much.
Please go ahead, sir. You have less than a minute.
Okay, well, top. Anyway, I think we need to look at the question of what I call the shrinking Pan-African space, in the sense that we talk about the shrinking civic space, and to see that in the weakness of some of the African institutions. So if you look at the debate about the ADB, for example, it has brought to light the fact that the biggest shareholders in is supposedly African Development Bank are actually, the Western powers, which reinforces the fact that dependent, capitalism is still a major problem for us. But I also feel we need to look at how do we build or rebuild Pan-African consciousness in such a way that it also helps us to get the next generation of cadres that Utive talked about. And in this regard, just to say that I'm happy that we have Dr. Fayemi on this program. We're looking up to people like him to look at how the educational curricula, even at the state level, could be redesigned in such a way that the books that our people read at secondary school level prepare them for the kind of battles ahead. In this regard, let me say that I got to know about apartheid in South Africa because self-freedom was a text for our WAEC way back in the 1970s in the secondary school. And even before we got to the final year in secondary school, we had read books like Zambia Shall Be Free, Mind Boy. Those were the kind of literatures that we read that gave us an idea that we need to fight injustice, both at the African level and at the national level. So I will feel that this is one area we need to look at. Odia started this program with a beautiful poem I was taken from a book, written on and of Taju. We need to see this kind of literatures being read by students at secondary school level. It prepares them for a lot of things, and some of the things we say about changing our society will not be strange to them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Landry. Thank you so much. Colleagues, I'll take 4 more comments, then I'll ask the panelists to reflect on what they've heard and reflect on on each other's interventions. So are there any last 4 persons who wish to, or 4 people who wish to comment quickly? I'm looking for some young people from Funtua, if you are on the line, or young people from Nairobi, from Southern Africa, from East Africa or North Africa, or from the diaspora, if you're on the line. If you are young, not just young at heart, if you're young and you qualify as youth.
Sorry, Brian. If we have people on Twitter, can they please use the hashtag Taju Abu Memorial?
Okay. Colleagues, you heard that. It's please, I know you typed it, please type it again on the chat, Taju Abu Memorial. Okay, I'm not seeing any hand, any volunteer.
Yeah, I'm volunteering, in fact, if you can hear me.
Yeah, go ahead, Professor. Go ahead, Junaidu.
Yeah, I just want to make 1 or 2 comments reflecting on my own experiences in the 80s. And I want to identify 3 basic issues around which I think we need to begin to focus. One is what I would call the virtual death of networking among African universities, particularly professional associations now. I think we need to find a way of reducing that whole process that created people like Abubakar Momo, Tajuddin, and myself and others. I think there's so much insularity now, and the state in various African countries have virtually killed professional intellectual associations as a voice. We need to find a way of reviving it and then connecting it at the Pan-African level with Pan-African professional associations. And this is very, very important, because I know that one very, very important thing that happened in the 60s was the role that these professional associations played in making the ECA an Afrocentric institution, which it is not now. And it is linked to this death of professional associations. The second point I want to make briefly is that our failure also is that we continue engaging in a dialogue of the deaf with political class. We need to find a way of connecting and mobilizing the masses of African peoples. We should mobilize to put this agenda, not talking to those who just think we are just talking and take us for granted. The third point I want to make is that we need again to find a way of boosting extra African continental accountability mechanisms that can support and strengthen domestic accountability mechanisms. I think that is very, very important. So those three things are important. Professionalizing, again, getting across to the masses, and then anchoring domestic accountability mechanisms on external African accountability mechanisms.
Yeah, and there are comments for the panelists under the question and answer tab. There are questions that you can also be typing responses. Can I take maybe one more? Is there somebody else who wants to chime in?
This is Ibrahim speaking from Senegal.
Thank you, Ibrahim Sal. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists, and thanks to CDD for this great initiative. I want to also salute the families, right, of Tajuddin and Momo. The night before, just a few hours before Taju passed away, we were in a meeting of the scientific committee of a conference on the United States of Africa that Senegal was hosting then. And at around 8 p.m., we were arguing very strongly that Tajuddin should be one of the very first speakers at that conference. And little did we know that he was actually just about to, go out and then meet his, that fateful event. And so it was something that really shook everybody. But I want to just make very quick comments. The first is, I think the point has been made by some of the speakers. The dynamics that we are going to go through over the coming years will be extremely complex. And I think there is a revival, a reassertion of narrow nationalism in the imperial centers. And I think the point about us making sure that we don't transition into a new world in which we are made to pay for the cost or bear the brunt of what the cost of the transition out of the COVID pandemic has been, that Horace was referring to, I think is a very extremely important point. The dynamics are going to be very complex, and there's the attempt to shift and to transfer costs to others, have been part of the game all along, and that game will continue. And I think Africa must make sure that we don't transition into a new world in which we are again at the receiving end of global power relations. The second thing is, I think the point about solidarity and Pan-Africanism, there is an interesting thing happening at the level of the young people of this continent, citizens movements, that are networking among themselves, that are resolving issues, trying to understand and, go back to the history and connect. So there's something happening, and I think there's a need to connect what is happening at the grassroots level between the citizens movements, like, Yanama or Lucha in DRC, Yanama in Senegal, you have others in Burkina Faso and elsewhere, that convene periodically, and there are the African social movements, barazas that are held. So there's something that's happening, I think, which we have to build upon and make sure that I think we approach you know, the coming years with probably a lot more closer interaction between those attempts to overcome the crisis and to deal with concrete problems, and those who are in a position in the universities, as has been mentioned earlier on and elsewhere, to help us to understand better what is emerging on the horizon. What is the future that we should be aiming at, you know, at moving into. But again, thank you very much for this great event and for the opportunity to say a few words.
You know, I know that Chidi is going to come back later on in an official capacity, but Chidi, I would like you to make a comment, not as part of your last comments, but your comments as Chidi, since your half-brother Dismas has not been able to comment. Just some quick comments, Chidi.
You're muted the microphone.
Sorry?
You're muted the microphone.
Oh. Thank you, Brian. I don't know whether I should appropriate the voices of the Ugandans here. I mean, Uganda was Taju's country too, and is my kind of adoptive country. But I'll probably just put one thing on the table. A bit of an anecdote as to something that Taju brought uniquely to this, and when I close, I'll talk about Abu. Taju was known for having popularized one maxim, which Governor Fayemi recalled when he intervened. But there was something else that Taju was known for: one struggle, many fronts. And that was his way of making the point that we should never think anyone too little or too irrelevant, and we should respect everyone and what everyone brought to the table. And I remember in 1995, after the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria and the Rwandan genocide, and we were trying to mobilize African institutions to do something. And no African country was willing, because it involved one troubled African country and one very huge African country. I remember having gone from South Africa, and Governor Fayemi, we went from South Africa through Senegal, Zimbabwe, up to Egypt, looking for an African country to host an extraordinary session of any African institution, and none was willing. And Taju came in and said, look, Chidi, you know what, are you willing? There's somebody you need to meet in Uganda. And he sent me on an errand to Uganda, Kampala. And the people we met with were intelligence officers from Rwanda and Burundi and Uganda, very senior intelligence operatives. And they listened to us and said, okay, let's give us a piece of paper. We'll get back to you on what you need to do. The long and short of that story is they got President Museveni to sign off on hosting an extraordinary session on Nigeria and Rwanda within 1 week. What the diplomats could not do and what the NGOs could not do. And I want to tell this story for one reason. We are at a juncture in which we need partnership between African institutions, African intellectuals, African governments. African governments exist for all of us. Whether they work or they don't work, they occupy space. And we have got to make sure that we collaborate with them and retain lines of dialogue with them. And that's why we're gratified that Governor Fayemi is here, not because he's an ex-comrade or the governor of governors in Nigeria today, but because he actually partner in the dialogue that we must have if Africa is going to recover from the COVID-19 crisis.
Brian, I need to talk. Hello, Brian.
Emmanuel Akwete.
Yes, it's taking you too long. Okay, hello to all of you, and congrats to CDD West Africa, and Kole especially, who got me linked up. Yes, I see Horace, and I see Kayode and all. Thank you. I've been inspired by Funmi's presentation and also Awino, because I want to talk about Taju and Momo, just the human beings they were. And many of you may know or not know that Taju was actually on his way to Accra to join IDEG and others to celebrate the AU Day when he passed, when the accident occurred. He was going through Nigeria to Accra. And this was a meeting arranged. But I'd come to know those two gentlemen that yes, leftists, they were strongly Pan-African, but there was something phenomenally human about them, how they connected to people and how they lived for people. They were very selfless in spite of their fierce intellectualism. They also looked at what was common across and connected. They made a lot of friends. So as we honor them and celebrate their work, I think what Africa lacks mostly is, and which COVID had brought together, is our humanity and how interconnected we are and how the weak in our society desperately need greater attention than all. Somebody asked, what is COVID doing? I thought for me, COVID has done a number of important things. The state is back because in this moment of crisis, globally, what we saw was that it was the state that people looked up to. But what kind of state? Was it the state that is addressing the needs of the poor and institutions that are designed just to get the best for them, the majority's concern and care? Somebody the other day said, so what happens after COVID? I said, probably after COVID, the debate between the state or the market probably is gone, and we are now going to hear what kind of state do we construct? So that takes me to a point, because I don't have time. What is the Pan-African state post-COVID? I think I do not want to see it only at the global and continental level. But for me, the Pan-African state must be seen also at a national level. And it is the state that across the continent, east, west, north, south, central, perform some basic functions that says that the welfare of the majority of Africans, their health, their education, their well-being, are the core functions that every state that claims to be a member of the AU and is pursuing Pan-African ideals must be seen to be performing. Because it is science, it is education, it is data, it is service, good health, and also decentralization. What is happening in local communities where people feel, yes, they are being catered for? So I like the point about the informal sector, the economies in which the majority operate, but probably the Pan-African state post COVID-19 is one that goes into that economy and says, what are the conditions that we create for them so that we can change and transform the structure not only of our economy, but the well-being of our people as we move forward. This is my contribution. Thank you.
Dr.
I can see you look handsome.
I'm trying to impress you and Brian and Funmi and Horace and
Let's limit the bromance.
Good to see you. Okay.
Yeah. Colleagues, Nick, you wanted to say something. If not, let me move back to the panel.
Well, can I say something? I wasn't intending. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Nick. Go ahead.
Yes, I came in a bit late, and I appreciated very much the intervention of Otivio, as well as several others. Akwesi knows quite well the agonies that I go through of late in this tail end of my life, wondering what legacy I can leave, looking at the younger generation, looking at Africa and saying, wow, what will the next century look like for these young people growing up? I put a note on, and I'm very passionate about connecting with people who are keen on making a legacy. We've talked, we've been at this stage. Coyote knows me, all the audience knows me. Several of the Horace is there. We're all familiar to ourselves. But the point that Otivio made keeps sounding loud and clear. What will history remember us for? What will the younger generation that we are living in this terrible period say to us when they meet us, wherever they meet us? But let's stop talking, begin to connect and do our own little thing.
Thank you, Nick. I saw Professor Okello Ochuli. I'll tell you, Taju's co-conspirator. So I'd said it was the last. Professor Chuli.
Can you hear me?
We can, sir.
Thank you. I want to join hands with, well, let me first start by thanking Kole for being one of the few supporters of my youth training program, in which I try to make young people see themselves as presidents of the future Africa. With special emphasis, fortunately, on girls who don't tend to get that kind of orientation given to them. And I believe that it's not enough to tell young people that you're the leaders of tomorrow. Their minds must be trained. And it is important to notice that most secondary school kids do not read the map of Africa, do not know which country borders which country, what the capitals of which country. They don't know who is the president of which country. A little test I gave of asking them to name presidents of certain countries. And Obasanjo had the luck of being the president of Algeria and the president of Mozambique. And I think it was Uhuru Kenyatta, or is it Gaddafi, who ended up being the most popular, and people wanted him to be their ruler in Nigeria. That was with undergraduates. The whole concept of training leaders of the future is something which has been borrowed by the Nairobi project of leadership training. I think it is something which ought to go down from just primary school all the way to university. And when I tried to interest, what's his name, Professor Bolaji Akinyemi, when he was head of the Nigerian Institute for International Affairs, he was concerned about the cost.
Julie, I'm going to ask you to speed up.
Okay. On the question of COVID, I would say that I agree with the proposition that our focus should be the governance that gives education, but more importantly, governments that questions the structure of governance as we inherited it from colonialism. For example, in the area of agriculture, those who do extension work, who get in contact with the least paid, the least target of even aid that comes into ministries of agriculture. In the area of health, we have seen this awakening of people to the role of nurses. We pay nurses very little. We pay those who don't deal with the terrible condition of a patient when a patient is helpless and cannot go to toilet, cannot what. It's the nurse that does it, but we pay the nurse very little.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. Colleagues, I am conscious of the limitations of time. We started off with Kayode, who raised the issue of how Abu and Taju were intergenerational in orientation and in mindset, always thinking about not the African struggle now, but the African struggle in generations to come. And that's the theme that Awino picked up and Chidi also reflected on, which is about inclusion, about opening doors. And then Horace located us in the urgency of the moment that we are in. The United States printing $6 trillion and preparing to recover from a depression worse than the 1929 depression. And the likelihood, given the threat to the status of the dollar as the dominant currency for global trade, the move to a multi-currency world, and also what this has in terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics. And Horace says, post the 1929 depression, it is the developing nations that paid for the recovery of the developed ones. And Africa is likely, unless if we wisen up and wake up to this reality, to bear the cost of this recovery. Although we are independent politically, we may, because of our economic dependency or our lack of ideation and seriousness about taking a collective position, be affected. So there is a defensive position, Africa's security, Africa's economy, and there is an offensive position, how Africa can use COVID as an opportunity. And there's also the creative position that Awino and others referred to, how Africa can begin to create for itself the conditions requisite for that recovery. And then there were fundamental questions raised on the chart. Thank you, Saram Kasa and others, about the African state. What kind of post-COVID Pan-African state? What kind of state? And Horace began to reflect on this. Others, Fumi also in reflecting on leadership, pointed out to this critical conversation we need to have. And I think related to that is the question of economic, social, and other policies. And I know that Horace is very passionate about this, to ensure that we don't create a hierarchy of humanity. And then the question of Pan-African consciousness has been raised, okay? We spoke about Pan-African consciousness, and also the question of ideology was raised, which is this, some colleagues have suggested that we go back to, we need a socialist state. Others couch it as alternatives to neoliberalism. Others couch it as solidarity economies. And I think that's a wide range of issues to reflect on, a continuum of imperatives. But I think the one thread running through that everybody referred to is we're reflecting on the lives of two human beings who lived out their Pan-Africanism and lived out their left politics by ensuring that they were building bridges, by ensuring that they were also enabling, opening doors, but ensuring that they treated country according to Kayode, although it's not one country, they did not see the limits of borders. And their Pan-African ideal that Horace reflects back to the 2007 summit was a key one. I would like to start off with Kayode and then go to Awino, and I'll come to Horace and end with you, Fumi. Go to Horace, Odia, and then Fumi. Just some quick reflections on what you've heard and also your takeaway for all of us as we reflect on this from global financial crisis to global coronavirus. Kayode, I know you have a lot to say about this. I've got 4 of your books behind me.
Sorry, Brian, I missed your last comment. Was I supposed to be saying something or?
You know, I didn't realize, my brother, that since you became a politician, you choose what to hear and what not to hear.
The connection has not been particularly good. I just lost what you said.
Okay, Governor. I was saying that from all the things that you heard, I know that beyond making introductory remarks, you have some critical views around the question of leadership, role of the state, Africa's place in the globe, and a post-COVID, if you like, Pan-African state or African economy, and so on and so forth. So let's take 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes each for the panelists. Just what for you are the most important takeaways as we reflect on from global financial crisis to global coronavirus?
Well, thank you, Brian. There's been excellent comments right from Maurice through Fumi to Awino and all the other comrades, or shall I say ex-comrades, as Chidi has decided to refer to some of us as. But well, I think the way I would like to see it, in your notes to us, you talked about Taju's Afro-optimism, and you want us to reflect on things that would celebrate that rather than agonize about the challenges that we're faced with. And I see corona virus as an opportunity more than an adversity. Yes, it is a challenge for all of us in the world, but there are things that we're used to doing that these last 3 months, we have not done it, and things have not necessarily gone haywire for us. And I see, even in linking that to the economy, for those of us who come from resource-rich state, we now know, if we've ever been in any doubt, that oil is not going to be the source of continuous wealth in our countries. And we need to be more grounded and need to be more inclusive in our development strategy, rather than focus exclusively on extraction, which ultimately coronavirus has helped us to sharpen the extent of its contradiction in our various climes. That's one. The second is that coronavirus has really made us narrower in our outlook. It's become a case of everybody for himself or herself, and God for us all. We're going into our bunkers. And maybe that has been typified mostly by Mr. Trump than anyone else, and Mr. Britain, the one who got infected with the virus too, Boris Johnson. But it is also happening to us in Africa. It's almost a one-size-fits-all response strategy. But that one-size-fits-all strategy is located within our various states, which sort of defeats Taju's or Abubakar's approach of, yes, we're different countries, but we're also one country. And we have one struggle. There are also many fronts to that struggle. How do we organize ourselves to respond to the same challenges that are global within our local context? In other words, to use the cliche, going global in a sense. How do we achieve that and still achieve robust developmental strategy that is inclusive, building their skills to respond to the what they generally refer to now as the fourth industrial context, and ensuring that we respond to the challenges of the bulk of our population without ignoring the rest. I mean, our situation, for example, cannot be dealt with the way the Italians would deal with their situation. 65% of our population is under 35. And they're not as affected by coronavirus the way they have been affected by the unemployment or hunger virus. So what we need to be responding to, without ignoring the challenges of coronavirus, is a broader political economy that responds to the wider challenges of our communities. And these were the issues that Taju and Abu actively engaged in their lifetimes. And I think it's something that we need to continue to work on. But a number of points were made that we cannot run away from, in the manner in which we need to re-engage and reconnect ourselves, not just in Pan-African academy, but even in Pan-African politics. The kind of connections that existed between the Kenyattas and the Awolowos and the Nkrumahs, or even in the immediate aftermath of the post-Cold War, the Obasanjo, Beckys, and the rest of them, is not exactly what we're experiencing now in Africa. And we need to find a way to respond, to return to that and make it more meaningful for our population.
I had indicated, but I think that my panelists have forgotten. Odia,
Yes, I think we are lucky that we have long distance runners in the Pan-African movement like Horace Campbell still with us, so that we can connect the dots from the past and link the dots to the future. What Kayode Fayemi has just told us actually leads me to what I think we should put on our platform as a plank. Isn't it possible for every African state to have it as a reason for being members of the African Union that every child must be at school? To say this in Nigeria means that we may need to plan for about 16 to 20 million children who are not being accommodated within the school system at the moment. And Africa and an African Union that wishes to stand up to the problems created by COVID-19 would need to be an Africa where, as much as possible, illiteracy will be eliminated. The reason we think of it from this standpoint is that when you look at the core issues in the COVID-19 crisis, it's all centered on knowledge and the use and misuse of knowledge. At the moment, we have a situation where those who are dictating how the world is responding have ensured that the rest of us do not have the means to take independent decisions. Even if we had independent decisions, we don't have political systems primed to make use of the powers already in existence. How do we strengthen our countries so that those who are trying to solve this problem do not merely use our own resources to recolonize us? Because at every level, whether at the level of the ECOWAS currency, whether at the level of the absence of connectives between African states, we seem to be quite unprepared. Let's think of all the old Pan-Africanists who started by saying, from Cape to Cairo, a railway. And these days, we can think of from the Gambia through all the coastal cities of West Africa, through to the Cameroon and to the Indian Ocean. We can actually build a railway system. And another one can take the Sahelian regions right through to Somalia. And across Southern Africa, we can link the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean as a matter of decided policy, which every child should be taught to buy into. If children are to be into it, it also means that in individual states, while Kayode Fayemi is building an educational system that will accommodate every child, we are people in public life whose ambitions are to link several Africans as intellectuals, as people in government, and as chiefs to help build a basis for connecting different Africans, especially the intellectuals.
Thank you, sir. Awino?
Thanks, Brian. Let me make 4 quick points. You may or may not recall this, but in my first meeting with you in 12 years ago in the organization I used to work for, you asked me that when you people, ex-organization, talk about your Pan-African program, what exactly do you mean by Pan-African? I make this point to argue that the Pan-Africanism and Pan-African ideals has become a placeholder for many things for different people. Much in the same way decolonization has become a word that is used for different things for different people. So when we talk about Pan-Africanism and Pan-African ideals as a central point that has been raised severally in this conversation, I think we need speaking about when we're talking about Pan-Africanism. Because for many people, it's used in very different ways and has sort of moved away from its original function around the mobilization of everyone of Black descent, whether they're located in Africa and elsewhere, around a common political agenda of self-determination. And really, if we center that as what we mean by Pan-Africanism, then this moment offers us an opportunity for greater global transnational solidarity amongst people of Black descent, wherever they're located, whether on the continent or in the African diaspora. The second point that I want to make, and it speaks directly to something Sarah posed in the chat, which is, she talked about what is the nature of the state. I want to answer this question in reverse, which is around the importance of political organizing. I think there's a lot of, sort of scholarly and academic analysis that has, thought through different kinds of models of governance arrangements and debates around the nature of the state, African state and otherwise. But for that to come to reality, you need political organizing. And political organizing here is not just social movements and people. You need political parties that can actually advance this agenda. So the charge that I put again to the group here today, what are the political parties that we are setting up as alternatives, or political structures and mechanisms that we are setting up as alternatives, to take up power and actually implement or begin the process of living into this state that we desire to see. The third point that I want to make connects to a point that Solomon Durso raised in the chat as well, which is around the fact that many of us are having these conversations now about the nature of leadership, the complexities, or the opportunities rather that COVID-19 offers for Africa. What are the modalities of connecting, bringing all those people having these conversations together so that at a minimum, we can shape, influence the policy-making spaces and governments where, that we have at the moment, the ones that we are stuck with at the moment. How do we ensure that these conversations are feeding into those spaces in ways that are effective and impactful? The final point is around effective political organization, particularly around social movements. And I join Ebrima in recognizing that there's a lot of work that is being done by young people, social movements outside of formal civil society organization. I'm also deeply aware of, and I'm aware of documenting, social protests across Africa, is that a lot of these movements have been captured by, whether you want to call it the deep state or whether you want to call it octogenarians who then show up in political parties and then take up power. They've been captured largely because social movements and citizen-based protests that are trying to push out people from political office are often very clear about what they're against. So we want Mubarak out, we want Mugabe out, we want Compaore out. But what are we for? So the question about defining the agenda that we actually want and how to live into that agenda is very rarely answered by these movements. And this is why I think the point around connecting to intellectuals, academics, and other public intellectuals in defining what we are for becomes a very critical point of connecting the energy that is pushing governments and strongmen out of office to leave office. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Horace.
Thank you. I also have 3 points I want to reflect on based on what was said in this wonderful gathering. The first is Akwasi's understanding of that their spiritual values that enriched those that they came in contact with. And their purpose was to uphold and to be struggle to be humans. This struggle to be human is at the forefront of our struggle today, because even the platforms we're using and the way we're moving into the digital economies and artificial intelligence has the possibility of dehumanizing us more and more and cutting us off from the kind of emotion and spiritual values that are very necessary to remember who we are. So I want to uplift that idea that the spirit of the people and the good spirits that are left behind, we should always try to uplift those spirits. The second is because persons like Gennaro and myself, we've been involved with institutions over a long time, is to deepen the point about the important role of progressive intellectuals and the reparative justice platform that has been set in motion by the International Decade of African Descendants. For 10 years, the United Nations is focusing on African descendants. And many of our brothers and sisters do not link themselves to this decade, especially as it relates to our brothers and sisters in one of the main arena of Pan-African struggle, that is the 200 million Brazilians, where we have more than 100 million people living in Brazil in some of the worst conditions. And the reparative justice platform that comes out of the Latin American caucus of the Costa Rica and Haiti. And the last point is about what the title of this discussion is about. It's about how do we transform the realities that we live in. And transformation is not simply a cliche. Transformation is all we bring to the forefront, all of the projects that we have for transformation. Well, one of the things that the possibilities of building a water transfer system from the Congo to Lake Chad through the Chari River, which would unite the continent and the peoples of Africa, and building the kind of infrastructure which would require the training of engineers, hydrologists, social scientists, people who will transform the conditions of life of people in the Sahel. And the reason we don't know about it is governments. I think that this discussion must be the purview of what they call donors, when they themselves siphon off billions of dollars in capital flight out of Africa. So what Odia is saying about linking different parts of Africa with infrastructure, we have the possibility now of intensifying the work among every child in school about what must be done, not only for their educational transformation, but to build their consciousness, to have the confidence that they
RS Fumi.
Thanks, Brian. I mean, I think it's amazing the range of views and so on. The richness of the conversation really confirms that we're aligned still with the very ideas and ideals of our colleagues and brothers that we are commemorating today. Let me make a couple of quick points. COVID-19 itself and the lessons that we can draw from this. There's no question that we've been forced or compelled to adopt new ways of working. Look at what technology affords us to do. I have seen names on the charts. I've listened to people comment that I haven't seen in ages. And had we been doing this in Abuja today, I'm not sure that all of us from our different parts of the world where we're speaking from now would have been in Abuja. And so I think the last couple of months have said a lot about how much organization, how much more we could organize differently and better. And I think that's number one. And I suspect that will not change even after COVID has been defeated. But two things were obvious in Tajuddin and Abubakar's lives, which somehow we have talked about them as though they're separate things that are not connected. So maybe in their lives, they sat in separate spaces when they were talking to next generation or to their counterparts, or indeed even to the generation that was leading just before them. And I think those are two golden things that have to connect. And we have to, in my mind, if we institutionalize these two things, the kind of transformation that we've been talking about might begin to take place, and hopefully still in our time. Pan-Africanism as expressed, I couldn't say it better than Horace and others have said it. But so far, we can see from the silence I talked about, from what Kaide mentioned about, the silence of the African Union because states retreated to their own, to within their own borders. If Pan-Africanism as we experience it at the continental level began to take people's, position, people's experiences as a starting point, that would be a major change. The fact that it has not done that successfully is why we have not seen that kind of relevance at this point in time. But the second thing is, if we therefore institutionalized intergenerational organizing, not just conversations, because in many of the spaces that I still see, apart from my classroom, I do not see people who look like the very students that I teach in the fora where I observe. Maybe many other people see that. That is a big, big gap. And therefore, if we took intergenerational organizing as a starting point, by the way, the next generation has already started organizing differently using technology. We are just now beginning to organize ourselves differently. But if you fused both of them, you begin to see new models of leadership emerge. And I think that what we are compelled to do, what we must do is be more critical about the very ideals that we have been pandering to all this time. I am not sure that Pan-Africanism as practiced, or that the way in which we have organized the state ought to be the way the state will be organized in the future. And actually the way 19 and 20-year-olds are organizing suggests that they will challenge fundamentally. We will see new ideologies, which hopefully will be progressive. I say hopefully because I don't know what will happen to those things unless we do have an intergenerational conversation to save what works and jettison what does not work. Finally, therefore, if we begin to challenge those ideologies, we need to re-question the basis upon which we have been engaging our continental union, our regions, in ways that have not helped the citizen, because really, and if they're going to be managers or gatekeepers of a particular agenda, let's accept that and spend our energies in other things. I suspect that Taju and Abu might be having that kind of conversation, but the solidarity with the next generation is where it starts from. Without that solidarity, the question of education that we're talking about will not take us where we need to be. My biggest fear, which I just hope is a point of worry and not the reality, is that if we don't align all of these things behind the next generation of Africans in schools and universities, we will be generating a power dynamic that means that young Africans are going to be lagging behind the global counterparts. The places where I teach at the moment, they're already beginning to embrace technology, and apart from South Africa and a couple of places, if you take Kenya and so on, we're still packaging the same tired ideas and trying to run curricula with that. And if we don't change or don't allow those younger people into the space where their own ideas are beginning to shape their world, which is their world, which is the near future, I think that the passion and the very agenda that is trying to mobilize a new Africa might be lost. I'm not saying it will be. I'm saying we need to prevent it from being lost. Thank you. I cannot thank Idayat and Kole and everyone, and you, Brian. Thank you, co-conspirator. Thanks for making this happen. I've seen so many names, on the charts, and I'm really, really pleased that we have done this. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Fumi. I will ask Chidi to make some remarks, then I will return with, and then we can close this.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just say how pleased we all are that this is taking place at so short notice. I think we've had about 120 participants, and the notice was very short, and they range from everywhere from Accra to Zimbabwe to Iceland, and there are some people from South and Southeast Asia. And it goes back to a point that that Awino made about Taju and indeed about Abu as connectors. They've connected us in life, and they've kept connecting us so many years after their departure. And for that, we must continue to honor their memory. But can I in particular also thank Governor Fayemi, not just because of his presence, but also because of his continuing commitment to these ideas. There are so many things that can keep him away justifiably from this gathering today. As I said, he's the governor of governors in Nigeria, and there are 36 of them from all kinds of parties. And believe me, they're an impossible people to govern. And that's apart from governing the most enlightened state in Nigeria. So yes, you're an ex-comrade. You're doing a very important job. We've not pensioned you off though, so don't worry about that. You still belong with us. And we're not going to allow, you're too important for us to abandon you to the politicians. Believe me. So we'll fight for you, and we'll fight with you. But if you would allow me, can I say a special word to the families of both Abu and Taju, who would have preferred to have had the right moment to the privilege of saying bye. We've been joined today by Ida, who is Taju's daughter. I believe Ida graduated with a first class from Leeds. And by the way, of course, Taju graduated with a first class as well. It runs in the family. And we just want to say to both, in the words that Horace has used here, your patriarchs will always be with us, and we hope that we will live, that you continue to hold up the torch, and we'll continue to provide some form of support and memorializing of what they lived for and what they made, the contributions they made in our lives. Thank you very much for having shared them with us, and for having shared them, with us, and for having shared them with our continent and our peoples right across the globe. To the substantive issues, I see so many people here. Solomon Derso, he's the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I see my supervisor, Chaloka Bayani at LSC, Dondea from Palu. But there's a point that Governor Fayemi made, which for me ended on about the crisis for regionalism and regional institutions. I see that Dr. Remi Ajibewa at ECOWAS is here, and there is also Dr. Kabela Matlosa, who is with us. And African citizens would complain, and it's arisen in these conversations, what do we do with our regional institutions, and what are they doing in this particular context? How do we connect with them in the fights that we invariably will have to engage with? And that was a point that Taju and Abu lived for, the Africa that had capability. And you can see former African presidents rising up to defend the independence of the African Development Bank right now in the fight that's going on over the leadership transition or leadership elections in the bank. How do we work with our governments and with our regional institutions in this kind of enterprise that has to be collaborative and in which all voices matter? That is one of the major issues that's come up in this, and I hope we can engage with our regional institutions on precisely those issues going forward. The second issue is related to this, and in connection with the work that Abu was doing when he died. He was the Director General of the Nigerian Electoral Institute. Elections are troubled in Africa today, largely because of COVID-19 in many ways. And as I say this, I remember Burundi has just had elections under cover of COVID emergency, in which allegedly 87% of the population participated, and the ruling party won with about 69% of the vote. If Abu had been alive, Abu would have found a way to put that on the agenda of every possible African institution. And the fact that in the aftermath of that, no African institution is saying something reminds us that a void was left by the passing of both Abu and of Taju. And we should not forget that these issues are important and these issues matter. As I say that, finally, there is the point of an intergenerational conversation and a cross-boundary conversation. And I pay tribute here to our friends from Uganda. I see Fozia Mkwinji, Sarah Mukasa, Dismas has been here as well. Taju, of course, was a Ugandan, and he took his Ugandan nationality very seriously and refused to surrender it in spite of everything. And I remember when we went to bury Noble Mayombo in Fort Portal, and President Museveni was asking him, oh, so you're still here? And Taju turned to Museveni and told him, you think you own this country by yourself? Now, that was the man. He was irreverent, he was irrepressible, but he also had a way of connecting the issues that mattered to us in a way that no other person could. And that was what made him such a major attraction to young people in the manner that Fumi and Awino have pointed out. And let's not forget, at the end of the day, nobody leaves this place alive. Every one of us, 117 of us still here, every one of us is guaranteed to be manure at some point over the next 50 years, if not earlier. And therefore, the question is, how do we replace ourselves? How urgently do we go about the task of replacing ourselves? In that task, Taju and Abu were peerless. COVID-19 must remind us of our mortality and of the need right now to be urgent in the task of replacing ourselves. And for that, we must continue in gratitude to memorialize Taju and Abu. Brian, over to you, please. Thank you.
Well, Horace is now awake. When we started, it was pretty early, and he was zoomed out. What are all these platforms that we use? Ida, it's a pleasure to have you here. Not only did you and your siblings, Momo's children, share your fathers with Africa, I think that although you don't have these 117 or 20 people plus many others in your life daily, what your father left you was a name, and that name will always pay dividends, no matter where you go. From heads of state to academics, to cantankerous characters like some of the characters I see on this call. We appreciate the sacrifices that you made so that Africa may benefit. I just want to thank Horace, Odia, Fumi, Kayode, Awino, Idi, and above all, Kole, Idayat, and the team at CDD West Africa. Thank you so much, not only for honoring the memory of these two gallant sons of the soil, but may we, as we go into next year, remember what I said at the beginning. We use the name Tajuddin and Momo as, if you like, as placeholders for the many great activists, many great intellectuals, many great Africans that have fallen. But may we also honor those that are still leading and living and have a way of connecting their ideas to the movements that are organizing and the movements to them. And this requires that we make sacrifices. Somebody said to me that until we imagine, as Taju and Momo did, that the place of youth is not just a place of voice or a space to be seen, but that place and that place of women, because I think we always have to say what Taju valued about these struggles. It is Awino Fumi will know that he had very strong views about women's agency and women's power. He didn't like the term empowerment, but that we can discuss later on. Agency and power was that he believed, as many comrades have said on the panel, that power had to be reflected in the economy, that power had to be reflected in technology, that power had to be reflected in development, including the social policy, but that power had to be reflected within the academy and all other spheres of life. So as we part, colleagues, I'll ask you if you are able to unmute your mic and we simply remember the slogan, one struggle, many fronts. Do not agonize, organize. And then we give a pam-pam to the families of Momo and Taju. If you are able to unmute your mic, and then we just give a pam-pam just to thank them and thank CDD for this wonderful session. 1, 2, 3, let's go.
One struggle, many fronts.
Struggle, many fronts.
Agonize.
Agonize, don't agonize.
No, someone got it wrong. Organize, don't agonize.
Comrades, colleagues, friends, Kwaherini, until we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Asante sana.
Merci beaucoup.